Okay guys, let's get started in CLO3D. So welcome to CLO. If you've never been here before, we're going to learn a lot today. So I'll explain what we're looking at right now, and I'm going to explain quickly how my viewport controls are set up. So on the left side of the screen we have a 3D workspace, and on the right side of the screen we have a 2D workspace. There's all the tools down the left and right side of the screen that we can work with, and there's additional tools in these menus up here. So we can find a lot of the tools that we need in the two different places, either on the toolbars or in these menus in the top. To start with, I'm going to go to settings and to user settings and show you how my view controls. So if you click view controls, this preset is how I've got mine set up, and I think it's called regular mouse. And I use my right mouse button for the rotate and for the pop-up menu, and the roll mouse for like the roll in the middle mouse button for the pan. I do this because then all of my controls are like in my mouse and I don't need to use the keyboard for anything. So this is how I've got my viewport control set up. So when I'm in the 3D workspace, I can use my right mouse click to rotate the space. So you see the ground plane is rotating. I can click the middle mouse button on my mouse to grab the screen and kind of drag around the viewport. And left click will select whatever is in my workspace. There's nothing there right now. So these are the navigations, and it's the same on this side. So the rolling of the mouse will zoom in and out, and if I click and drag the middle mouse button, it will grab the screen and allow me to drag the 2D workspace around. So to introduce you to how this all works, I'm gonna insert a piece of fabric into our 3D workspace, and I'll do that by using the tool here on the right side called Polygon. If you long click on this and you select rectangle, like a menu should appear if you long click, choose the rectangle tool and then just draw a rectangle in the 2D window. This should then appear directly in the 3D workspace here. And if you want to see how big this is in terms of dimension, press Shift and Z on the keyboard, Shift and Z, and it will bring up the dimensions of this this is set in centimeters. So this is about 3.5 meters by 3.5 meters, which is quite big. So if I now wanted to edit this, I could go and use the transform pattern tool here, which the shortcut for is A. So if I press A, I'm now in the transform pattern tool, so I can grab the pattern and move this around the 2D space. I can also click on this on the left side of the screen and drag this around in 3D space as well. And I can use this gizmo to rotate and to move this around in 3D space where I want to. A note on the gizmo, if I go to preferences and to gizmo, which is this little set of circles and arrows that is basically allowing us to navigate, we can get this to work in two different ways. So I have mine now, if I go to preferences and gizmo, set to world coordinate, but you could set this to local, and then it would match the direction of the fabric. So I prefer to have this set to world. Just do. Honestly, if you're struggling to move things around in the space, just go here, go to preferences, gizmo, and choose world. So now that's kind of explaining how this gizmo works from the 3D perspective. If you want to resize this now, you can just drag and transform this in the 3D space, and then the 2D space, and the update will obviously appear in the 3D space. We can start to create pattern pieces here in this way, or we can use the polygon tool here. So if you long click the polygon tool, again the square, and you choose polygon, you can now free kind of draw. If you click and drag, you can make curved lines to create pattern pieces, you know, in whatever kind of shape or dimension that you want. Then in order to make this respond to gravity, which is essentially what this 3D workspace is doing, we need to hit the simulate button up here on the top left side. So this is the arrow kind of pointing down, and if I click this now, you'll see them fall to the ground. There's no avatar in here, there's nothing for this to collide with, and if I click this again, it'll turn off the simulation. And then I can again navigate in this 3D workspace. If I simulate something and I don't want it to be simulated anymore, I can right click on the piece in the 3D space and click Reset 2D Arrangement, and that will reset it in the 2D space that it is on this here. The same for this one. If I right click and click Reset 2D Arrangement, the pieces are now reset. So I'm just going to click this one and press delete on the keyboard to delete this piece from the workspace. And I'm just going to look at this square that we've created here. So I'm going to use the edit pattern tool. So if you press Z on the keyboard, Z, and choose the edit pattern tool, you can now choose one edge or a point of this pattern piece and drag them to reshape this piece. So, I could grab this one and, move it around. This is how we can start to edit the pieces. What I'm going to do first is select the top edge, right click and click offset as internal line. And what that will do now is it's created a pattern, like a line within this pattern piece at 0.5 centimeter from the edge. So if I want this to be 4 centimeters, I can enter 4 as a value in this distance here, and I will get a line 4 centimeters from the edge. I can increase the number of offsets to repeat the number of lines that I will get, but I just want one for this example. And I could even apply individual distances to each of these lines. I don't want to do that. I just want to have all the lines as 4 centimeters, and I want to have one line. And I've got extend applied, so that means it will extend from each end of the pattern piece. It will go all the way across, which can be useful when you're drawing lines inside a pattern piece freehand. So I'm going to click OK here. And then if I kind of zoom in on this piece, I click on the line, I right click what I've selected, and I click cut and sew. I would now cut this piece away. So I now have two pattern pieces. I have a small one and I have a big one. If these numbers are, annoying to look at all the time, you press Shift and Z to turn it off, Shift and Z to turn it on. That will just, control the distance. But because I clicked cut and sew when I separated these pieces, if I look at the sewing machine icon here on the top right, so these are our 3 sewing options. If I click the edit sewing, which is B as a shortcut, you'll see there's a sewing line being added. So this red line and this sewing in the property editor here shows us that we've got sewing applied. And this is also visible in the 3D space. So if I select the top piece here and I drag this up, you'll see I now have all these little lines connecting, which is essentially the stitching. This is the sewing that's connecting the pieces together. So if I take this top piece, I right click on it and I click freeze. This frozen piece now is turned blue, and this will not be affected by the simulation whatsoever. So this will just stay in its position like frozen where it is, and this piece will be able to simulate. So if I press the spacebar on the keyboard, that's the shortcut for the simulate option. So if I hit spacebar, the fabric kind of jumps up and it's now stitched. So if I click on this fabric now and I hold my click and I drag, I can interact with this fabric in 3D space when I'm draping. Then if I hit the spacebar again, I turn off the simulation and the piece will be held as it was in that last moment of simulation. Again, if I press simulate again now, so I hit spacebar, this will drop back down and the fabric is now actively simulating. I'm going to turn the simulation off and just quickly look at some more of these settings on the side that we can look at here. So if I zoom out and I drag and extend this pattern piece a little bit longer, say half again longer, the same will happen in 3D space, but the simulation will not look great, obviously, from the point where we've dragged it across. So if I choose the piece in 3D space, drag this around, you'll see that all these stitches now are kind of gathering back into the same length as this piece. So if I simulate now, you'll see we have the illusion of gathering, because this piece is now a lot longer than the frozen piece that we're working with. So it's given us this kind of gathered edge. So now we've got some kind of definition in this pattern piece. I can start to talk about some of the simulation settings. Okay. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the particle distance. So if I zoom right in on the top here, you can see the simulation looks a little bit blocky as it comes across this gathering here. And if in my viewport, I want to look at how this looks in terms of the 3D mesh that we're creating. This little blue piece of fabric that's folded in half here shows us that we're looking at this in thick textured surface view. So this is showing us a fabric with thickness, and it's showing us a texture applied to it. And right now that texture, if we look on the right side of the screen, is this white texture that is in this fabric 1 here. This is fabric 1, it's the white one, that's the texture that's being displayed. If I click the fabric, I scroll down on the right side in the property editor and I go to color and I click this color. Click on color, and then you can choose from either the Pantone color libraries that are here, or you can choose a value in here, whatever you want, maybe this orange, for example. Choose a color, anything you want, and this is how we can just quickly add a color to what we're doing. For now, I'll leave it something a bit kind of white or gray. And I can look now at what this 3D mesh looks like. So like I said, this is the thick textured surface view. This is the thin textured surface. So if we look now on the reverse of this, this has now a gray, kind of grayed out back. If I look at it in thick, this grayed out back is gone. It's visible on both sides because we're looking at this with thickness on both sides of this mesh. If I look at it in thin view, this indicates which side is the back and which side is the front based on the direction that this fabric is facing in. So right now we're looking at the front of it because it's the clear section. I can turn off the texture view altogether and look at monochrome surface here. So this just shows everything in white. Or I can look at the mesh. So mesh is the fourth option here that I can choose. And you'll see that it is constructed of all these tiny little triangles. Those triangles are what give us the definition of these folds. So as you can see, if you zoom in, where these folds start to appear, we have the triangles following those edges. So the more triangles we have at these edges, if I make this black, it might be easier to see. Yeah. If you look, as this gathering is starting to happen, these are the edges that are being created to create these gathers in this 3D mesh. And if we want these gathers to be more delicately defined, we need to have more mesh and less space between each of these edges. So right now, if I go to the right side and look at the property editor with this pattern piece selected, and I look at the simulation properties, if I scroll down and see particle distance, this is set to 20. So what that means is from this point to this point and this to this, and the point from between all of these points is 20 millimeters. So that's 2 centimeters from point to point. If I drop this down to 10 and hit enter, CLO will update this mesh, and you'll see now the change that happens. So from this point to this point, and from all connected points, everything is now 10 millimeters, which is 1 centimeter in difference. So if I go back to the thick textured surface view and I hit simulate again, you'll see this will redrape and we'll have a lot smoother folds starting to be produced as this gather is happening. And that's because we're creating a much more high resolution mesh. So if I zoom out, we have these really nice, kind of little creases happening. It's looking like a curtain. And if I simulate one more time with the simulate using the spacebar, and I grab this, this is going to react a little bit slower in response to like me trying to work with this in 3D space because it's set to a particle distance of 10. So for that reason, when you're working in CLO, it can be beneficial to work in a particle distance of, let's say, I'm about to turn this off, say around 15, so that we have more mesh to create a nice look with, but we don't have so much that it's going to slow down the processing of CLO and the computer. So again, if I hit spacebar to simulate, this will kind of simulate again now, and this should be easier to kind of interact with when we're draping or working or sewing things together. And then when we want to have a high level of detail, if I turn off this simulation here, I select the piece again and I drop this down to 5. 5 would be my limit, I would say, for you to work with. Don't go anywhere really below 5 unless you absolutely need to for a specific circumstance. But anywhere below that and your computer's going to get really, really slow. So I'm just going to go back here to the left side, choose this blue folded icon on the left side of the screen, go back to the mesh view and zoom in again, and you'll see now that this is 5 millimeters from point to point. So we have a very fine mesh. This one in the top, this piece is still set to 20. So you see here, this is still quite a wide amount of mesh. This is a very delicate mesh. And if I look at this in the, even in the thin view, and I simulate this now, this should have a really nice drape and fall to the fabric. But it's going to take longer for this to happen in terms of processing power and in terms of flow responding to this simulation, because there's a lot more calculations need to happen. So even now this is running quite slow, but you see after we wait a second, these gathers become really nice and delicate, but you see the simulation itself has become quite slow and choppy as this comes through. So be very much aware of particle distance affecting performance, and to find a happy measurement to work with inside your own your own computer. So that kind of explains how particle distance is working. I'm going to select this piece and go back to 15 because I want to be able to interact with this quite easily. Set this to 15. And we can then look at the simulation types and at the fabric properties. So again, if I long click on the simulation, I will get a submenu that pops out, and there's 3 different types of simulation that we can work with. There's fast, normal, and fitting. So if I go first to fast, which is GPU based, as you can see here, it says GPU. This will only work if you have a GPU that will run this type of simulation. I think on a MacBook, this might not work. But if I click this as a simulate option now, this is really smooth and quite easy to interact with, but it's a bit bouncy and it responds quite differently to the CPU simulation. This GPU can be useful to work with when you're quickly simulating cloth together, when you're stitching pattern pieces quickly and you've only got single layers. But as you see, it can get a little bit buggy and kind of have some of these little intersections. So use GPU when you need to. I would work with normal as a rule. So if I turn this back to normal and simulate now, you see this intersection's kind of disappeared, and this is easy to interact with, but it's not as fast as the GPU, but it's a lot smoother. It's a lot more accurate to like the real way this fabric would react. And if I go here and choose fitting, fitting is more intense on your computer to activate, but it will be more accurate in terms of the fit. That's why it's called fitting. It should produce a much more accurate simulation, but it will run a little bit slower, and it will mean that when you select the fabric, it's a little bit harder to interact with. It gets a little bit choppy and a little bit buggy at some points, but this will be a much more accurate simulation in terms of the final look in the end. I would only use this when you've really finished modeling your garment or modeling whatever it is you're working on, and come into this final level of simulation when everything's in place and you just want to really make that cloth drape to finish off with. I'm going to hold down the click again and just go back to normal and simulate this in the normal view, because I think this is fine to work with for now. I'm going to turn it off, and I'm going to go over here to my object browser and choose the fabric that I'm working with and scroll all the way to the bottom, which is the physical property. And under this preset, it's set to custom. So right now it doesn't have a preset, it's just this custom one that is being used by CLO to create the fabric. But if I open this menu up, I have all the different fabric presets that CLO has pre-installed. So I have wool, like thick fabrics, I have all these silk options, muslin, interfacing, knits, cottons, cotton shirting, cotton twills, all these different things you could imagine we already have as presets to work with. So to see the difference, if I choose here cotton heavy canvas and I resimulate this again, the fabric will become a bit stiffer. I don't know how noticeable it is in this scenario, but it will react a lot more like a stiffer denim or a stiffer cloth. And if I go here to silk knit jersey, for example, you can see the fabric kind of drops down because it has some stretch into it now. So if I grab this now, this will move a lot more like a jersey fabric would. So these presets are very accurate in terms of their description, I find, and some of them are a lot more stable than others. So if you go to silk chiffon, this kind of shrinks back up now because there's no stretch in it. And this will move quite freely because it's very, very lightweight. And you can look at those parameters of how this fabric is set up. I'm just going to turn the simulation off while I do this. If I choose the fabric again, I look under the preset, this is set to silk chiffon, and I open up details. Under here, there's all these different parameters that are used to kind of control how this fabric responds in the 3D simulation. The one that you want to look at, the only one that I ever really find myself looking at is density. So if you drop this menu down here and look at density, this is 27 grams per square meter, and this grammage is quite often easy to find when you're working with a fabric. So if you have a physical fabric you want to replicate, you can select the nearest parameter here. So if it's, if it's a cotton fabric, choose cotton twill, for example, if there's no stretch in it. And then if you know that your fabric weight is 280 grams, you can enter that 280 grams here, and this fabric will now weigh 280 grams per square meter. So you can bring in those real world properties in these settings here. So that's under physical property, and in the details panel, you just drop that detail menu in and out here. And this is also where you can affect the thickness. So if you go to the left side again, choose this little display option, this folded piece of fabric with the blue outside, go to thick, and then zoom in on this fabric. If I set this thickness to 5 millimeters and then hit enter, you should see that this fabric now has quite a thick edge up on it here. If I go back into single face view, basically, there's no thickness at all. There's just a front and a back. But if I go back into thick view, there's a lot of thickness here comparatively. I can add more thickness to this. I could put this up to 10, and this becomes really thick, like you see more here on this piece, how this thickness works. But if I simulate now, this will affect how the fabric responds because of this thickness. So it will have to collide with itself to become thick like this. So if I select my fabric, I go to my physical presets down here, I choose wool, for example, and then I simulate this. This is now an accurate simulation of a very thick wool fabric, like a 1 centimeter thick wool. You can add into these thickness values. So if I select this pattern piece, either in the 2D or 3D space, if you scroll down to simulation properties on the right side, where we had particle distance before, under this, you have shrinkage and you have additional thickness. So you can add additional thickness into the collision of this, and it has 2.5 by default. So if I put these down to 0.5, we might see a change in the collision of this when I resimulate the cloth. The folds might be able to fall a bit easier next to each other because there's less additional collision. So this is collision in addition to the thickness that we've already set in this fabric. If I want to add that into the rendering, I can make that visible by also putting 0.5 into the rendering, and it'll make the fabric visually 0.5 millimeters thicker. Again, if I put 10 here and 10 here, this will now become 10 millimeters thicker, and you can see that is done visually, like this is being applied to my mesh. But if I don't put it in the rendering option, I put 0, this is applied to the collision and not applied to the rendering. So if I simulate this now, this fabric is starting to kind of shake because there's an additional 10 millimeters of space around this that it's being collided with. So if I turn this back down to 0.5, that shake has now gone and the fabric has kind of settled down. So if there's ever a point when your fabric is shaking and wobbling during the simulation, check what your thickness values are in terms of additional thickness and rendering additional thickness, and make sure these values aren't too high. What I can do now is explain how these shrinkage values work. So I'm just going to grab this pattern piece. I'm going to shrink it back down to the size it was before and just re-simulate this kind of straight out. So this kind of just automatically drags itself into position. If it goes a bit chaotic like this, you can right click and click strengthen in the 3D window and then simulate again, and the strengthen will kind of make the fabric a bit stiff and rubbery almost to kind of push it back into its original position. And then if I right click and turn on unstrengthen, and it'll go back to normal and just kind of float like a regular piece of fabric. If I want to add into this shrinkage or remove from this, what I can do is use these percentages here. So the weft will go from the right to the left, and that is in terms of the grain line we have here. So if on the right side of the screen there's this little piece of checkerboard fabric with a little arrow, and that allows us to move print or graphic around this space, but it also shows us our grain line, and our grain line is pointing up and down. So the weft will be from the left to the right, so across this arrow is the weft, and the warp is the length here. So if I add into the warp 110% and I simulate again, the fabric will become 10% longer. So that is additional into the warp. If I put in here 90, it will become 10% shorter. So you can use this to make the fabric shrink, and you can use it to make the fabric expand based on the direction that this line is going in, because this is our grain line. So if I want to make this seem gathered, like we had before, I could just add into the shrinkage value here and put 125, for example, and that will add into the width of this fabric, and it will now start to gather in at the top because we've added in. But I've not changed the proportions of my pattern piece here. This pattern piece is exactly the same as it was before. I've not changed the dimensions of this, I've just added into the values here. This can cause issues with texturing and things later on, so use this sparingly and only to add kind of surface detail when you need to. I advise that you expand your pattern pieces to the correct measurements in order to do things like gather and these kind of details. But it's good to know what these shrinkage values do in order of allowing you to expand and contract pattern pieces that might need adjustments that you really don't want to change them in the 2D workspace. So that's a useful trick to know. If I go as well to select this piece of fabric and I go to the bottom, I have this section called miscellaneous right at the bottom, and this is by default set to triangle. So if I look in the view options again here at the mesh view, so clicking on the blue icon again, going to mesh view, and I zoom in, these are all set to triangles. If I go to this miscellaneous option, drop this menu open, go from triangle to quad, this fabric will now turn into squares instead of triangles. It'll take a minute for color to calculate this happening, and this can be useful depending on what you're exporting from CLO. So you see now this is built up of all square kind of edges rather than triangular edges. This will respond in the same way when we simulate it, but it might be a bit heavier in processing time because of the way that the engine is calculating triangles versus quads. So you see now that I start to simulate this, so it really has to calculate this again. It will react in the same way as before, but this can be changed depending on what your output is in the end. If you want to sculpt on your mesh in another 3D program and you don't really want to use retopology, you could use this because you could subdivide this mesh a lot easier inside other 3D programs. But I advise that you work with your mesh type always set to triangle. So I'm going to set this back to triangle because it will just flow a little bit easier inside CLO when you're simulating it. There is a difference, and when you test this, you'll understand what I mean. But that's how we can triangulate or use quads to build our mesh, and I will usually work in triangles. Sometimes on export you can change to quads, like I said, if you need to subdivide in other programs. I'll set the view back to thick so I can see the whole fabric, and I'm going to look now quickly at the elastic tool. So if I go to the edit pattern tool on the right side or press Z on the keyboard, and I choose the bottom edge of this piece of cloth here, just the single edge, and back in the property area on the right side, I choose elastic and select the elastic option. This ratio is set to 80 and the strength set to 10. So what that means is we will have 80% of this length here will remain and 20% will be contracted into the elastic. And the strength of that contraction is set to this value of 10. If you increase this, it will pull harder, but right now this will be the default value. And if I just simulate this now, you'll see the green line has appeared that indicates we have elastic. If I hit the space bar, you will see this kind of contracts now as if it's got a piece of elastic in the hem of this piece of fabric that we've created. If I zoom in, I select this line, I right click, I set offset as internal line. I increase the number of offsets to 3, let's say, and I click OK. I could then select these lines and also to these click elastic in the elastic option here on the selected line. And that will allow me to also elasticate an internal line as well. So if I simulate this again, you'll see the rest of this is kind of starting to pull together. The thing that you will notice if we look at this mesh in the mesh view, so I'm selecting again on the left side to go to mesh view, it gets a bit screwed up, and we can combat that if I click one edge, just the edge of the pattern, and I go down to the right side and I go to the shearing option and I turn shearing on, like put the checkbox for shearing on in the right side. And you'll see now that from here to 4 centimeters, we have a lot more mesh to kind of give us definition of how this is going to fall together. But I want this to extend from 4 to 8 to 12 centimeters. So under the height, under the shearing option, I'm going to enter 12. And my shearing should then extend. Is there a limit to this? So the limit for the height of the shearing is 9 centimeters, it seems. So I'm just going to delete this top elasticated line. And you see now that the mesh from these 3 lines where the shearing is applied in this distance has now got a lot more mesh compared to what's above this. So if we resimulate this, in theory now we should get a much smoother simulation on the edge of this fabric because of having this applied. So I'm going to go back into the thick view here. And this should have a lot more definition. Again, we can increase this definition if I choose the fabric, I go to my particle distance, I change this to 10. And if I go and set my fabric, because right now we're set to wool, which is a very thick fabric, if I go from wool in this preset on the right to, let's say, cotton 40s poplin, so like a shirt weight fabric, and I resimulate this, we'll get kind of a nicer elasticated effect, I think, on the end of this. You see this now looks a bit crisper, like a cotton fabric. So this is how we can, really control the look and feel of this fabric as we're starting to simulate it. I think that kind of sums up this video for part 1. I've kind of gone over how most things are going to work right now. In the next part, we're going to look at patterns and sewing things together, working with avatars and everything, but now we should know most of the tools. The one last tool I can show you actually is the iron, the steam tool here. So if you click the steam tool and then you click and kind of drag around, you will keep clicking, you will start to see this blue appear, and this blue is shrinkage. This is where we've kind of taken out. The shrinkage is set to -2. The size of my brush, the size of this brush that I can steam with is here, and the fall off on the edge, the hardness of this brush is here as well. And what that means is if I apply all this steam here and then I resimulate this cloth, it will shrink away. So if ever you have areas that you want to shrink as if they've been steamed or ironed, you can do that with this tool right here. So that's the last one I think that's useful to know about at this point. But in the next one, we're going to look at patterns, avatars, and working with the sewing tool and bringing everything together. So see you there.